November 1943. Kure Naval Arsenal, Japan. The rain fell in sheets across the concrete docks, where submarines lay like sleeping iron whales, their hulls glistening black under floodlights that turned the night into harsh daytime, where the smell of diesel fuel and welding fumes mixed with the salt spray coming off Hiroshima Bay, where Lieutenant Hiroshi Kuroki stood before a blueprint spread across a workbench in a maintenance shed and contemplated a design that his own Navy had forbidden him to build, had called a waste of precious resources, had dismissed as the desperate fantasy of men who had already accepted defeat, even though the war still raged across the Pacific with an intensity that consumed ships and lives at a rate that made Kuroki's hands shake when he read the casualty reports from battles at Guadalcanal and the Coral Sea. The blueprint showed a weapon that was technically a submarine, but philosophically something else entirely, something that existed in the space between torpedo and suicide capsule, between weapon system and martyrdom device. It was a human-guided torpedo, a Type 93 long lance modified with a tiny cockpit where a pilot would sit during the final run toward an enemy vessel, steering with precision that no mechanical guidance system could match, ensuring that the weapon's 1,550-kilogram warhead would strike exactly at the target's most vulnerable point, the waterline amidships where the explosion would break the ship's keel and send it to the bottom within minutes. Let's pause here for a moment. If you find value in stories like this, you can support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. After watching, leaving a brief comment, even a simple word, helps more than you might expect. Your support keeps these stories alive and visible. Thank you. Let's move on. Kuroki was 28 years old, a naval engineering officer who had graduated second in his class from the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy at Etajima, who had spent 4 years designing torpedo systems and studying the physics of underwater explosions, who understood with crystalline clarity that Japan was losing the war, not because its warriors lacked courage, but because its weapons lacked the decisive power to sink American aircraft carriers and battleships faster than American shipyards could build them. The industrial mathematics was brutal and unforgiving. For every Japanese ship sunk, America launched 3 new ones. For every Japanese aircraft destroyed, America produced 10 replacements. For every torpedo fired, only 7% found their targets because mechanical guidance systems were too crude to compensate for target evasion, ocean currents, and the 1,000 variables that made long-range torpedo attacks exercises in statistical probability rather than certain destruction. The human-guided torpedo would change that equation, would transform hit probability from 7% to 95% or higher, because a human pilot could adjust course in real time, could track evasive maneuvers, could compensate for current and wave action, could ensure that the weapon struck home with the certainty that came from having a conscious mind controlling the final approach. The cost was absolute. The pilot would die in the explosion, would become part of the weapon's destructive mechanism, would sacrifice his life to guarantee the target's destruction. This was the element that made Kuroki's design simultaneously brilliant and monstrous, the element that had caused the Naval General Staff to reject his proposal when he submitted it in August 1943, to issue a formal directive forbidding further development of weapons that required pilot suicide, to reassign Kuroki to conventional submarine maintenance, where his engineering talents could be employed in less philosophically troubling directions. The rejection letter, which Kuroki kept folded in his uniform pocket where he could feel its weight against his chest every time he moved, stated, "The Imperial Japanese Navy does not build weapons that guarantee the death of their operators. Such devices represent a failure of engineering imagination and strategic thinking. Lieutenant Kuroki is ordered to cease all work on human-guided weapons and report to conventional submarine maintenance duties immediately. His proposal is hereby classified as forbidden development, and all documentation must be destroyed. But Kuroki had not destroyed the documentation, had instead hidden the blueprints in a maintenance shed where inspectors rarely ventured, had continued refining the design during off-duty hours, had recruited 3 young enlisted sailors who shared his conviction that conventional weapons were insufficient, that desperate times required desperate measures, that the philosophical objections of staff officers sitting safely in Tokyo meant nothing compared to the practical reality of American fleets dominating the Pacific, while Japanese naval power bled away in battles where courage alone couldn't compensate for inferior numbers and firepower. The weapon he called kaiten, meaning return to heaven or change the tide, was mechanically simple, which made it feasible to build despite the prohibition, despite the lack of official authorization, despite the very real possibility that unauthorized construction of forbidden weapons would result in courts-martial and execution. The base was a Type 93 torpedo, Japan's finest naval weapon, a 24-inch diameter cylinder powered by pure oxygen combustion that could travel 40 kilometers at 48 knots, faster than most surface ships could flee, carrying a warhead powerful enough to sink a cruiser with a single hit. Kuroki's modification was to cut away the torpedo's guidance section and replace it with a cramped cockpit barely large enough for a seated pilot, a space measuring 120 centimeters long and 60 centimeters in diameter, a coffin-sized compartment with a tiny periscope, a control stick connected to the torpedo's rudder mechanism, a depth gauge showing meters below surface, a speed control throttle governing the oxygen engine's output, and nothing else because comfort and survival equipment were irrelevant when the mission ended in guaranteed death. The pilot would be loaded into this compartment while the kaiten was still attached to the deck of a mother submarine, would be sealed inside with a hatch that could not be opened from within, would breathe through a compressed air tank sufficient for 6 hours of operation, though the actual mission would last perhaps 30 minutes from separation to impact. The mother submarine would approach within 5 kilometers of the target fleet, would surface briefly to launch the kaiten, then dive immediately and retreat while the human torpedo accelerated toward its prey at maximum speed, the pilot steering by periscope toward whichever target seemed most valuable, most vulnerable, most worthy of the sacrifice that was about to occur. Standing in the maintenance shed with rain drumming on the corrugated metal roof, Kuroki ran his fingers across the blueprint's faded lines and calculated what it would take to actually build the weapon, despite the ban, despite the prohibition, despite the very explicit orders forbidding exactly what he was contemplating. The materials were available. Damaged Type 93 torpedoes arrived regularly at Cure for refurbishment, and nobody would notice if one disappeared from inventory, listed as beyond economical repair, and scrapped. The machine tools existed in the arsenal's workshops, capable of cutting the precision components needed to modify the torpedo body. The welding equipment could seal the cockpit section with watertight integrity. The technical challenges were manageable for an engineer of Kuroki's skill level. The real barrier was psychological, the weight of knowing that he was building a weapon designed to kill its operator, that he was creating a device that would transform young sailors into explosive projectiles, that success would be measured in dead pilots and sunk enemy ships with no possibility of separating those two outcomes. This burden sat on Kuroki's chest like a physical mass, made breathing difficult some nights when he lay awake and contemplated the moral arithmetic of trading one Japanese life for one American warship, contemplated whether that exchange rate justified the horror of sending men to certain death, contemplated whether the philosophical objections raised by the Naval General Staff might actually be correct, and his engineering solution might actually be monstrous regardless of its tactical effectiveness. But then he would think about the casualty reports, about the submarines that sailed out and never returned, sunk by depth charges and aircraft bombs before their torpedoes could even reach firing range, about the conventional torpedo attacks that missed their targets 73% of the time and wasted resources that Japan could barely afford to expend, about the alternative future where the war continued along its current trajectory until American forces reached the Japanese home islands and the final battles killed millions in defense of territory that could not ultimately be defended because the industrial imbalance was too severe, the resource disparity too overwhelming, the mathematical logic of attrition too unforgiving. In that calculus, the chiton seemed almost merciful, seemed like a way to give individual warriors the power to inflict damage disproportionate to their numbers, to trade their lives for strategic results that might actually matter, to die in ways that had tactical meaning rather than disappearing beneath the waves in submarines that sank without ever engaging the enemy. Kuroki convinced himself, in the deep hours before dawn, when rationalization felt like wisdom, that building the forbidden weapon was actually an act of compassion, that giving pilots the means to guarantee their sacrifice counted for something was better than sending them to die in conventional submarines, where their deaths accomplished nothing except incrementing the loss statistics that headquarters compiled in neat columns that never captured the horror and waste of lives spent without achieving anything except their own extinction. So in December 1943, while snow fell on Kure and turned the arsenal's industrial landscape into a scene of strange beauty, Kuroki began unauthorized construction of the prototype chiton, working in the maintenance shed during night shifts when supervisors were absent, using a damaged Type 93 torpedo officially marked for scrap, cutting and welding with equipment signed out under false pretenses for supposed repair work on conventional systems. His 3 enlisted assistants worked with the devotion of believers in a forbidden faith, understanding that they were violating direct orders, understanding that discovery would mean courts-martial, understanding that what they built would kill whoever used it, yet believing somehow that this transgression served a higher purpose than obedience to regulations written by officers who didn't understand how desperately Japan needed weapons that actually worked against the American naval superiority that was strangling the empire's supply lines and isolating its Pacific garrisons. The construction took 7 weeks. 7 weeks of careful fabrication where every weld had to be perfect because the pilot's life would depend on watertight integrity during the approach phase, even though that life was forfeit during the impact phase, where every control system had to function flawlessly because mechanical failure would waste the pilot's sacrifice by causing premature detonation or missed targets, where every component had to be tested and retested because this weapon, unlike conventional torpedoes, carried human cargo that deserved equipment that wouldn't fail, even as it carried them toward certain death. By February 1944, the prototype was complete, sitting on a wheeled cradle in the corner of the maintenance shed covered by a tarpaulin, a cylinder 7 meters long and 1 meter in diameter, painted dull black with no external markings to identify its purpose or origin. It looked like a torpedo because it was a torpedo, looked conventional because its revolution was hidden inside the small cockpit section that disrupted the clean lines of the weapon's profile. Kuroki stood before it and felt both pride and revulsion, felt the satisfaction of having solved a difficult engineering problem and the horror of having created a device whose sole purpose was to turn human beings into explosive components. Testing was impossible. You couldn't test a suicide weapon without producing a suicide, couldn't validate the design without a volunteer willing to actually guide the chiton through its full mission profile, including the final detonation. Kuroki could test the oxygen engine's function, could verify that controls responded properly, could confirm that the periscope provided adequate visibility, but he couldn't test the fundamental concept without doing the thing that the concept existed to accomplish, which was to kill the operator while destroying the target. This paradox haunted him through February and into March as he tried to decide what to do with his completed weapon, as he contemplated whether to reveal it to his superiors and face courts-martial for disobeying the ban, or to quietly dismantle it and forget the entire project, or to somehow demonstrate its viability in a way that would overcome the Naval General Staff's philosophical objections and force them to acknowledge that, forbidden or not, the chitin represented a weapon that Japan desperately needed if it hoped to have any chance of inflicting sufficient damage on American naval forces to make continued prosecution of the war too costly for the United States to sustain. The decision was taken from him in late March, when a visiting admiral, conducting a routine inspection of the Cure Arsenal's facilities, happened to enter the maintenance shed, looking for a private location to smoke a cigarette away from subordinates who might disapprove of senior officers indulging in tobacco during duty hours. The admiral, whose name was Oikawa and who commanded the 6th Fleet's submarine operations, discovered the chitin under its tarpaulin when he leaned against what he assumed was stored equipment and felt the covering shift to reveal the mysterious cylinder beneath. Kuroki, summoned to explain the unauthorized construction, stood at attention before Oikawa and prepared to accept whatever punishment seemed appropriate for his insubordination, prepared to argue that the weapon justified the violation, prepared, if necessary, to defend the chitin with the same passion that had driven him to build it despite the prohibition. But Oikawa, after examining the weapon and reading Kuroki's technical specifications, surprised him by saying, "This is the chitin design that the General Staff banned last year. You built it anyway. Why?" Kuroki took a breath, tasted the shed's air heavy with machine oil and salt spray, and said, "Admiral, we are losing the war because our weapons are insufficient. Conventional torpedoes miss more often than they hit. Our submarines are being sunk before they can attack. The Americans have more ships than we have torpedoes. This weapon changes the mathematics. A pilot can guarantee a hit. One chitin can sink one enemy vessel with certainty. The cost is 1 life per ship. But we are already losing lives without sinking ships, so the exchange is strategically favorable, even if it is philosophically troubling." Oikawa was 62 years old, a veteran of naval warfare since the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, a man who had seen enough death to understand that philosophical purity was a luxury that nations at war could rarely afford, that survival sometimes required accepting methods that peacetime conscience would reject, that the moral clarity of peacetime regulations dissolved into ambiguity when the alternative was national extinction. He looked at the chitin for a long moment, looked at Kuroki, whose expression showed equal parts defiance and fear, then said, "The General Staff banned this because they are afraid of what it represents, afraid that building weapons requiring pilot suicide means we have accepted defeat. But you are correct that we need weapons that work. Conventional approaches are failing. I will take responsibility for this. You will complete testing. If it works as you claim, we will deploy it regardless of the ban, and I will deal with the consequences in Tokyo." This was authorization by a flag officer senior enough to override the General Staff's prohibition, at least temporarily, at least long enough to demonstrate whether the chitin concept had merit beyond its horror. Kuroki felt relief mixed with renewed dread, because now he actually had to find volunteers willing to pilot the weapon, had to find men willing to die in order to prove that his design could kill them effectively while simultaneously destroying enemy ships, had to confront the reality that engineering success would be measured in death rather than in the usual metrics of performance and reliability. Finding volunteers proved easier than Kuroki expected, which was its own kind of horror. When word spread through Cure Arsenal that a new special weapon was being developed, that pilots were needed for a mission requiring extraordinary courage, 32 sailors and junior officers volunteered within 24 hours, each one writing formal petitions explaining why they should be selected, each one accepting with apparent eagerness the implications that special weapon and extraordinary courage clearly meant suicide mission in the context of Japan's increasingly desperate strategic situation. Kuroki selected 2 volunteers for initial testing. Ensign Sekio Nishina, aged 22, a submarine officer who had survived the sinking of his previous boat, and who wrote in his petition that he wished to die usefully rather than simply waiting for the next American depth charge to kill him anyway. And Petty Officer Hiroshi Fukuda, aged 19, a torpedo-man whose brother had died at Midway, and who stated that he wanted his death to count for more than his brother's had, wanted to guarantee killing Americans, rather than disappearing beneath the Pacific, without knowing whether his sacrifice had achieved anything. The first test run occurred in early April 1944 in the inland sea between Shikoku and Honshu, where relatively calm waters allowed for controlled conditions, where a derelict merchant ship served as the target, anchored 2 kilometers from the mother submarine that would launch the Kaiten. Ensign Nishina entered the weapon's cockpit at dawn, his body folding into the cramped space that barely accommodated his seated form, his hands gripping the control stick with white-knuckled intensity, his face visible through the open hatch, showing an expression that mixed exhilaration with terror, showing the face of a man who knew with absolute certainty that the next 30 minutes would be the last he would ever experience. Kuroki stood on the mother submarine's deck and felt his chest constrict as sailors sealed Nishina inside, as they bolted the hatch closed with 16 fasteners that could not be opened from within, as they prepared to cast off the Kaiten and send it accelerating toward the target with its human cargo steering toward impact and detonation. This was the moment when the abstract concept became concrete reality, when the engineering drawings became human death, when Kuroki's trick stopped being theoretical and became actual. The Kaiten separated from the mother submarine at 602 hours, its oxygen engine igniting with a bubbling roar that churned the water to white foam, its nose dipping below the surface as Nishina adjusted ballast and depth control, its propeller accelerating it to 40 knots as it aimed toward the distant target ship that appeared in Nishina's periscope as a dark silhouette against the rising sun. The mother submarine dove immediately, its crew watching through the periscope as the Kaiten's wake drew a white line across the calm water, closing the range, tracking straight toward the target with the precision that only human guidance could provide. At 0615 hours, the Kaiten struck the derelict merchant ship amidships at the waterline, traveling at maximum speed, and detonated its 1,550-kilogram warhead with a blast that threw a column of water 60 meters into the air, a column that contained vaporized steel and atomized explosive and atomized human remains that had been Ensign Nishina 3 seconds earlier. The merchant ship broke in half, its keel shattered by an explosion occurring exactly at its weakest structural point, both halves sinking within 4 minutes, while the detonation's shockwave radiated outward and rocked the mother submarine even at its safe distance. Kuroki, watching through the periscope, felt tears streaming down his face as he witnessed the successful test. Tears that were simultaneously joy at having proven his concept viable and grief at having just killed a man to prove it. Tears that expressed the fundamental contradiction of success measured in death, of engineering triumph purchased with human extinction. The weapon worked exactly as designed. The pilot was dead exactly as intended. The target was destroyed exactly as predicted. By every objective metric, this was success, and by every subjective human standard, this was horror. Admiral Oikawa, who had observed the test from the mother submarine's conning tower, turned to Kuroki and said, "Your weapon functions. We will begin immediate production. I estimate we can build 50 Kaiten per month starting in June. That means 50 enemy ships sunk per month with near certainty, assuming we can find pilots. Can you design a larger version that can strike aircraft carriers? Their armor requires more explosive force." Kuroki nodded, unable to speak through the constriction in his throat, unable to process the Admiral's calm discussion of production rates and variant designs, while Nishina's atomized remains were still settling back to the ocean's surface as an oily sheen mixed with debris. But he understood that war demanded this compartmentalization, demanded that engineers focus on technical problems while ignoring moral implications, demanded that success be celebrated even when success meant perfecting methods of killing both enemies and the operators of the weapons designed to kill enemies. Production began in May 1944, Cure Arsenal converting a warehouse into a specialized Kaiten manufacturing facility, training workers in the precise fabrication required, establishing quality control procedures that would ensure each weapon functioned perfectly because pilot lives depended on equipment reliability, even though those lives were ultimately forfeit. The ban was quietly forgotten, never officially rescinded, but simply ignored as production accelerated and as volunteers continued stepping forward to pilot the weapons that Admiral Oikawa euphemistically described as special attack craft, rather than using more accurate descriptions like suicide torpedo or human-guided death machine. By September 1944, 32 Kaiten had been built, and 8 operational submarines had been modified to carry them, fitted with deck-mounted cradles that could launch 4 Kaiten per boat, converted into mobile platforms that could deliver 8 guaranteed ship kills per patrol if all weapons functioned, and if all pilots maintained their nerve during the final approach. The first combat deployment was scheduled for November against American naval forces operating near Ulithi Atoll, a major anchorage where intelligence indicated the presence of multiple aircraft carriers and battleships, targets whose destruction would justify the sacrifice of 8 pilots if the attacks succeeded. Lieutenant Kuroki was not scheduled to accompany this mission. His engineering expertise was considered too valuable to risk in combat operations. But he watched from Cure's docks as the submarine I-36, carrying 4 Kaiten and their pilots, departed on November 8, 1944, watched as the boat slipped beneath the calm water and disappeared, carrying 8 young men toward a battle where 4 would die as pilots and 4 would survive as the mother submarine's crew, carrying weapons that Kuroki had designed and built despite the prohibition, carrying the proof of his forbidden trick toward an encounter with the British and American fleets that had no idea what was coming. The attack occurred on November 20, 1944. I-36 approached Ulithi under cover of darkness, surfaced briefly at 04:30 hours just outside the atoll's defensive perimeter, launched all 4 Kaiten within 6 minutes, then crash-dived and retreated at maximum speed while the human torpedoes accelerated toward the anchorage at 45 knots, their pilots steering by periscope toward the massive warships silhouetted against the dawn sky, toward targets that represented the industrial and military might that was crushing Japan's ability to continue the war. 3 of the 4 Kaiten found targets. The first struck the fleet oiler USS Mississauga, a tanker carrying 404,000 gallons of aviation gasoline, striking at precisely 05:47 hours amidships, where the explosion ignited the fuel cargo and transformed the ship into a floating inferno that killed 63 sailors and burned with such intensity that the heat could be felt on ships anchored 300 meters away. The tanker sank within 2 hours, taking with it fuel intended for weeks of aircraft carrier operations. The second Kaiten struck the destroyer escort USS Underhill, penetrating below the waterline and detonating against the ship's magazine, triggering a secondary explosion that broke the vessel into 3 pieces and killed 112 sailors instantly. The destroyer sank in less than 90 seconds, so quickly that survivors found themselves in the water before they fully comprehended that their ship had been attacked. The third Kaiten struck the British light cruiser HMS Ajax, a veteran warship that had fought in the Battle of the River Plate against the Graf Spee, that had survived multiple Mediterranean engagements, that had seemed invincible until it suddenly wasn't. The explosion occurred below the forward magazine, detonating ammunition stores that had been carefully handled for years, but which proved quite capable of exploding when struck by 1,350 kilograms of explosives traveling at 45 knots. The cruiser didn't sink immediately. British damage control was too skilled, British compartmentalization too effective. But the explosion killed 47 sailors, ruptured the hull in 3 places, destroyed the forward gun turrets, and left the Ajax crippled, listing 12 degrees to starboard, requiring emergency repairs that would take 4 months and remove the cruiser from combat operations during a critical phase of the Pacific Campaign, when every combat-effective warship was desperately needed to support the Philippines invasion. The 4th Khitan's fate was unknown. It either malfunctioned and sank without detonating, or missed its target and continued until fuel exhaustion caused it to sink with its pilot still sealed inside, or possibly struck a target that didn't sink and whose captain chose not to report the attack because admitting that an unknown Japanese weapon had damaged his ship would invite uncomfortable questions about how such an attack could have succeeded against supposedly impenetrable defensive perimeters. British Admiralty reports, declassified decades later, described the Ulithi attack with language suggesting profound shock. A new form of Japanese attack has been encountered involving what appears to be human-guided torpedoes of extraordinary power and precision. 3 ships were struck with devastating effect, suggesting that Japanese forces have developed a weapon system that defeats conventional defensive measures. The psychological effect on fleet anchorages is severe, as there appears to be no effective defense against weapons that are guided with human intelligence and motivated by suicidal determination. Recommend immediate reassessment of anchorage security and development of countermeasures against this previously unknown threat. The word shocked appeared 7 times in the 12-page report. Shocked that Japan still possessed the technical capability to develop new weapons this late in the war, shocked that the Imperial Navy had abandoned its traditional emphasis on warrior honor and instead embraced weapons that required pilot death, shocked that the attacks had succeeded despite American and British confidence that their fleet anchorages were secure from Japanese submarines that had been largely neutralized by improved anti-submarine warfare throughout 1943 and 1944. What shocked the British most profoundly was not just the tactical success, but the strategic implication. The realization that if Japan was willing to deploy weapons requiring certain pilot death, then the invasion of the Japanese home islands would face resistance that accepted casualties at rates that Western militaries considered insane. That the final battles of the Pacific War would be far bloodier than any previous engagement, because the defenders' willingness to die would be operationalized into weapons and tactics that Western military doctrine had no framework for understanding or countering. News of the Ulithi success reached Kure Arsenal on November 25, 1944, transmitted in a coded message that caused celebration among the Kaiten production workers, caused pride among the pilots training for future missions, caused satisfaction among the senior officers who had authorized production despite the ban. For Lieutenant Kuroki, the news brought complex emotions that he couldn't easily articulate, emotions that mixed vindication with guilt, pride with sorrow, satisfaction that his trick had worked with horror at what his trick had accomplished. His forbidden weapon had killed 4 Japanese pilots and approximately 222 Allied sailors, had sunk or crippled 3 warships, had validated the concept that human guidance converted torpedoes from probabilistic weapons into certain kill systems. His engineering had succeeded. His insubordination had been proven correct. His violation of the ban had been justified by results that could be measured in enemy tonnage sent to the bottom and Allied naval operations disrupted. But in quiet moments, when he walked through the production facility and watched workers assembling the cramped cockpits that would contain young men during their final minutes of life, when he saw new pilots arrive for training and understood that most would be dead within 2 months, when he contemplated the moral arithmetic that traded individual lives for tactical victories, while the strategic situation continued deteriorating because Japan simply couldn't build chitin fast enough to offset American numerical superiority, Kuroki wondered whether the Naval General Staff's ban had actually been wisdom rather than timidity, whether their philosophical objections had recognized something important that he had dismissed as bureaucratic caution. The alternative argument, the justification that let him continue working, continue improving the design, continue training pilots to die, was that soldiers and sailors died in war regardless. That conventional warfare also killed them, but killed them without guaranteeing results. That at least chitin pilots knew their deaths would accomplish something measurable rather than simply adding to casualty statistics that represented lives wasted without corresponding enemy losses. This logic provided comfort on some days and felt like rationalization on others, depending on whether Kuroki was reading success reports or attending memorial services for pilots who had departed and not returned. Production continued through December 1944 and into early 1945, the manufacturing rate reaching 40 chitin per month as planned, sufficient to equip 10 mother submarines with 4 weapons each, sufficient to sustain a campaign that could theoretically sink 40 Allied ships per month if all weapons functioned and if all pilots maintained course until impact. The theoretical calculation was magnificent. A weapon system that could potentially reverse Japan's naval disadvantage through sheer willingness to trade individual lives for individual enemy vessels. The practical reality was messier because war is always messier than theory, because some chitin malfunctioned before reaching targets, because some pilots experienced control failures that sent them into depths where pressure crushed the cockpit before detonation could occur, because some mother submarines were themselves sunk by Allied anti-submarine forces before they could launch their weapons, because the American and British fleets learned quickly and adapted their defensive postures and developed countermeasures that reduced chitin effectiveness, even though they couldn't eliminate the threat entirely. By March 1945, approximately 100 chitin attacks had been launched, resulting in perhaps 20 confirmed ship sinkings or severe damage, a 20% success rate that was extraordinarily high by the standards of conventional submarine warfare, but which meant that 80 pilots had died without accomplishing their missions, had sacrificed themselves while their weapons malfunctioned or missed targets, or struck ships that absorbed the damage and continued operating. This was the horror that Kuroki had tried not to think about when designing the weapon, the possibility that pilots would die without their deaths mattering, that the sacrifice would be wasted through mechanical failure or tactical bad luck, or simply the fog of war that made even certain things uncertain. The war ended in August 1945 with approximately 400 chitin built, approximately 150 pilots dead, approximately 35 Allied ships sunk or severely damaged. The cost-effectiveness was debatable. 150 Japanese lives for 35 enemy ships represented an exchange rate of roughly 4 pilots per vessel, which seemed favorable until you calculated that those 150 pilots were trained submariners whose conventional careers might have achieved more cumulative damage over time, might have survived to fight multiple battles rather than dying in single attacks, might have contributed to Japan's naval capability in ways that single-use weapons couldn't. But this cost-benefit analysis missed the point that drove Kuroki to build the chitin despite the ban, missed the essential desperation that made suicide weapons seem reasonable to engineers and admirals and pilots who understood that conventional approaches were failing, that Japan was losing not because its warriors lacked courage, but because its industrial base couldn't match American production, that some form of asymmetric warfare was necessary if the nation hoped to inflict sufficient damage to negotiate terms less catastrophic than unconditional surrender. Lieutenant Kuroki survived the war, surrendered to American occupation forces in September 1945, provided technical briefings on chitin design and production to U.S. naval intelligence officers who were simultaneously fascinated by the engineering and appalled by the philosophy, who studied the weapons with the clinical interest that military professionals apply to enemy innovations, regardless of how morally troubling those innovations might be. American engineers examining captured chitin noted the elegant simplicity of the design, the effective use of modified torpedo components, the clever integration of human guidance into a weapon system that had previously relied on mechanical seeking systems that were far less accurate. One American intelligence report stated, "The chitin represents sophisticated engineering applied to barbaric tactics. The Japanese solution to guidance problems, replacing mechanical systems with human pilots, achieves accuracy impossible with our technology, but at a cost we would never accept." That they were willing to accept this cost suggests a cultural willingness to embrace death that Western militaries cannot match and should not attempt to emulate, though the tactical effectiveness cannot be denied. In the decades after the war, as Japan rebuilt and as historical analysis replaced wartime propaganda, the chitin became controversial within Japan itself, seen by some as heroic sacrifice in desperate circumstances, and by others as wasteful expenditure of young lives in service of a war that was already lost. A weapon system that represented Japan's moral collapse rather than its martial spirit. Kuroki, who lived until 1987, gave few interviews but occasionally spoke to historians studying the Pacific War's final phase, and his statements suggested profound ambivalence about his role in creating a weapon that killed both enemies and friends with equal certainty. In a 1982 interview, asked whether he regretted building the chitin despite the ban, Kuroki said, "The Naval General Staff was correct to forbid it. They understood that building suicide weapons meant accepting defeat, meant admitting that we could not win through conventional means, meant sacrificing our warriors not in battle, but as components of weapons. I ignored the ban because I thought tactical success justified philosophical compromise. I was wrong about that. The chitin sank ships, but did not change the war's outcome. The pilots died, but their deaths did not save Japan. If I could return to 1943 and face that choice again, I would obey the ban and accept courts-martial rather than build weapons that killed the men who trusted my engineering to give their deaths meaning." But then he added, in words that captured the impossible moral position of engineers working in war's service, "Though I must also admit that if I had obeyed the ban, those ships would still have sailed, those battles would still have occurred, and Japanese submariners would still have died attacking them with conventional torpedoes that mostly missed. The chitin at least gave them certainty that their sacrifice counted for something, even if it counted for less than we hoped. Perhaps that small certainty justified the horror of building weapons designed to kill their operators. I genuinely do not know. I have spent 40 years trying to decide, and I still do not know." This uncertainty, this inability to definitively judge whether the forbidden weapon represented engineering triumph or moral catastrophe, characterized most discussions of the chitin in post-war analysis. The weapon worked as designed. That much was indisputable. The weapon accomplished tactical objectives. 35 ships sunk or damaged represented real impact on Allied operations. The weapon required pilot death. This was inherent to the design and could not be separated from its effectiveness. Whether these three facts added up to justified innovation or unconscionable horror depended on philosophical premises about the value of individual life versus collective survival, about whether desperate circumstances excused desperate measures, about where exactly the line existed between acceptable military sacrifice and unacceptable use of soldiers as expendable weapons components. Different observers drew this line in different places, meaning that the chitin remained controversial long after the war ended, long after the weapons themselves had been scrapped or placed in museums, long after the pilots who died guiding them had become names on memorial walls rather than living men with families and futures. The British sailors who survived the Khitan attacks, interviewed decades later for oral history projects, expressed shock not at the weapon's tactical effectiveness, but at its philosophical implications. Shock that an enemy they had respected for naval competence and warrior tradition had embraced tactics that seemed to abandon both competence and tradition in favor of desperation. Shock that the war had driven Japan to field weapons that killed their operators as surely as they killed their targets. Shock that human beings could be so casually integrated into explosive mechanisms with no possibility of survival. One British survivor from HMS Ajax, speaking in a 1990 documentary about the Pacific War, said, "When we learned what had hit us, when we understood that it wasn't a conventional torpedo, but a man inside steering it toward us, accepting his own death to guarantee ours, we were shocked at what the war had done to both sides, shocked that we had reached a point where such weapons seemed necessary to someone, shocked that young men were volunteering for missions that guaranteed they would die, shocked that their officers were accepting these volunteers and sealing them into what amounted to mechanized coffins and launching them toward us with orders to die killing us." This shock, repeated across British and American naval personnel who encountered or learned about the Khitan, represented not just tactical surprise, but existential horror. Horror at the realization that the enemy's willingness to die exceeded Western military culture's frameworks for understanding sacrifice, horror at the practical implication that the war's final phase would be extraordinarily bloody because Japan had systematized suicide into weapons and tactics, horror at the recognition that victory would require killing people who sought death with the same intensity that most soldiers sought survival. Lieutenant Kuroki's forbidden trick, his engineering solution to the problem of torpedo accuracy, his violation of the ban against suicide weapons, ultimately shocked the British not because it was effective — military effectiveness was expected from a competent enemy — but because it revealed a gulf in cultural assumptions about what was acceptable in war, about where the boundaries of military innovation should be drawn, about whether there existed any limit to what desperation could justify. The Khitan sat in that liminal space between weapon and war crime, between tactical innovation and moral abomination, between engineering achievement and humanitarian catastrophe. That it was all of these things simultaneously, that it could not be categorized simply as good or evil, but existed in the complex gray zone where military necessity intersects with ethical boundaries, made it a weapon that shocked not just through its explosive power, but through its philosophical implications, through what it revealed about how far nations would go when facing extinction, through what it demonstrated about humanity's capacity to rationalize horror when the alternative seemed to be defeat. When Kuroki died in 1987, his obituary in the Asahi Shimbun newspaper noted that he had designed the Khitan and that this design had contributed to Allied naval losses in 1944-1945. The obituary did not mention the ban, did not discuss his insubordination, did not explore the moral complexity of building weapons that killed their operators. It simply stated facts. He designed it. It was built. It was used. Pilots died. Ships sank. The war ended. He lived. He died. But in that spare recitation of chronological facts lay the entire horror and triumph of the forbidden weapon, the way engineering achievement could be simultaneously technical success and human tragedy, the way one man's decision to ignore a ban and build a weapon that his superiors had called a waste of lives could change tactical realities while failing to change strategic outcomes, could shock enemies while consuming friends, could represent both the best and worst of what human ingenuity could accomplish when applied to the eternal problem of finding more effective ways to kill. The Khitan remains today in museums, in historical exhibits, in documentary footage showing the cramped cockpits and the launch procedures, and the memorial photographs of young pilots who climbed inside and never climbed out. It remains as a question that history cannot definitively answer. Was Lieutenant Kuroki right to build it despite the ban? Or was the Naval General Staff right to forbid it in the first place? The ships he sank suggest one answer. The pilots he killed suggest another. And the space between these answers, the vast uncertain territory where tactical success and moral failure can coexist, where innovation and horror can be aspects of the same design, that is where the Kaiten actually lives in historical memory. Not as a simple weapon, but as a complex question about what we are willing to do to win, about what costs we are willing to impose on ourselves and others, about whether the forbidden thing that shocks the enemy also shocks the conscience of those who chose to build it, despite knowing exactly what it would cost.